More often than not, the people experiencing those issues, they're the experts. They're the ones that know what is needed and what's going to make a difference.
Purposely Podcast, speaking with social entrepreneurs and charity founders and leaders, people who are making the world a better place. Here's your host, Mark Longbottom.
Welcome to Purposely with Stacey Thomas, CEO of the Wyatt Trust. It's one of the oldest private endowed foundations in Australia. Stacey is also CEO of a South Australia Community Foundation. It's a startup donor-advised foundation that the Wyatt Trust is helping to get off the ground. So incubating, if you like. Really enjoyed my conversation with Stacey. She's had a phenomenal career in philanthropy. Kind of just ask you to hit follow, whatever platform you're listening on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. It helps me get the message out there. Enjoy. This episode of Purposely was brought to you by Benevity, all-in-one software solution that benefits employees, customers, non-profits, and society. Let's get back to the show. Stacey Thomas, a really warm welcome to Purposely Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're the CEO of the Wyatt Trust. It's an endowed foundation based in South Australia. What's its mission and does it have a vision? Tell us a bit about it.
Yes, the Wyatt Trust, we're one of Australia's oldest charitable foundations. We've been around for 137 years. So we're a private charitable foundation and our vision is for a South Australia free from poverty.
Wonderful. And it's got an interesting history. It's one, as you said, one of the oldest foundations in Australia. And I've done a bit of digging, and someone who's kind of from the UK, Dr. William Wyatt, is the founder, isn't it? And it was his funds that he gifted into an endowment, and it's those money, well, it's the interest from that money that does good today. Tell us a bit about the history, because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so Dr. William Wyatt was from Plymouth originally, born in 1805 or thereabouts. He was one of the first arrivals here in the colonies, what is now South Australia. So he and his wife and family came over here to really try and make a different start, a new beginning for themselves, likely trying to climb the ladder a little bit as well and taking the opportunity that a fresh start would bring. They arrived here and he's really what we call a civic polymath. So a man with a finger in every pie, it seemed, but all seemed to have a social purpose. So when he arrived here in what we now know as Adelaide, he was involved in everything. He was a justice of the peace, a magistrate. He was the interim protector of Aborigines for a while there, a surgeon. At one stage, he was the state coroner. He was the first chief inspector of schools and actually a founder and board member of what are now several exclusive private schools here in the city. And he was on the board of many institutions that still stand today and that are familiar names, including the Botanic Gardens, the History Society, State Library, Adelaide Hospital RSPCA, the Adelaide Zoo, the list goes on. So he really was, for the 50 years that he was alive here in Adelaide, involved in many, many things. But what was actually quite a tragic story is that he and his wife had 5 children and they all predeceased him. His children all passed away. So in 1881, he wrote his will, leaving his estate to the Wyatt Benevolent Institution, and this came to be on his passing in 1886. So Dr. Wyatt wanted the trust to support people in poverty, and within 6 weeks of his passing, the trustees had awarded our first ever grants. For many, many years, these were annuities with people receiving direct support from Wyatt.
Yeah, phenomenal history and a life of adventure, of some wealth, but also, as you touched on, tragedy as well. And kind of looking forward and to the modern day, you guys still use, the trust still uses his interests or his family, his interests and belief in doing good around poverty and also around medicine, but his other interests to guide your grant making today in the modern world?
Yeah, so he left instructions in his will and on the establishment of the Wyatt Benevolent Institution. We do actually have an Act of Parliament and that was changed recently to modernise that a little bit. So in the original wording, we did have to look out for South Australians that were of the labouring class, that were of good moral character, and things that potentially aren't quite as relevant in a contemporary society. So more recently, that Act of Parliament was amended to just focus on the poverty element. So South Australians that are in poor and needy circumstances is the wording of the Act. We wouldn't use that wording in the way that we communicate our work, but that's really what South Australia is here to expect from Wyatt, that support for people in financial hardship.
And the main areas of focus, employment, education, housing, financial literacy, those are the main areas you focus on?
Yeah, and the areas really that we're looking for a pathway out of that financial hardship. So they're definitely main ones, but really we're moving towards people directing what it is that they need. So it's not for us to say that we will preference education or housing, for example, over anything else. People that are experiencing that financial hardship determine what it is that would help them most at their time of need, and we'll certainly work within that.
Yeah. And an endowment of 75 million gifting or donating approximately 3 million a year, those sort of figures?
Well, the bequest was £50,000. And so now we're looking at about 100 million, obviously give or take day to day, depending on what the market is doing. But we're sitting at around 100 million endowment at the moment and distributing between $3 and $4 million a year. That's correct.
And for our international guests, I think it's probably important we take some time just to understand where SA is, as it's called, South Australia. So one of the things that sort of stood out to me was that it borders all the main Australian states, which is news to me.
Yeah, we're a very large state in landmass, not so much in population. We're under 2 million people in population, but we are very, very large. And that actually is one of the challenges of working in this state, because we have our main city, Adelaide, on the southern boundary of the state, but we also have some very regional and very remote communities as well. So you get a little bit of everything in South Australia, one of the things that we love about it.
And you're unique in many ways. One of the ways you're unique is you have two roles, not just one role, but two roles. So you're also the leader or CEO of a community foundation, so Foundation SA. And from what I can tell, not quite as long, but for almost 3 years, you've held that position. Community foundations play quite a different role to a sort of endowed foundation.
Yeah, that's right. And it is a bit of a unique situation to be leading the two different entities. So Foundation SA is a statewide community foundation, and we have a vision of a connected, resilient, sustainable South Australia where everyone belongs. And it's fascinating to be leading one of the country's oldest with one of the country's newest community foundations. But we really saw this as an extension of Dr. Wyatt's legacy and all of the things that he was involved in establishing. And we saw a real need for South Australia to have that statewide community foundation to complement the existing regional ones. And so the board were up for it. Let's do it. Let's try and establish this statewide community foundation. And here we are with the two entities working side by side.
So just when you got the role with the Wyatt Trust, did they sort of a couple of months later announce that they were giving you another role? Or was that always the plan?
No, there was definitely no plan. So I started the role solely as the CEO of the Wyatt Trust, and Foundation SA was not on the cards at that time. But what happened is early into my role and tenure here at Wyatt, we would have people approach us and donors approach us with, not insignificant amounts of funding and ask us to distribute that on their behalf. But we weren't able to because it didn't meet our objects. And we had nowhere to refer them. There was no other entity that could help donors get the funding to where they wanted to go. And so we saw that gap and that need. And I took that to the board and said, look, crazy idea, but what about if we had this side hustle of a community foundation? I think it would be really great for South Australia. And they were certainly excited by the prospect. So we're an implementation partner of Foundation SA. We currently are incubating it, if we wanted to use that language. But over time, that will definitely spin out and become independent, and that will be passed over to the next CEO of Foundation SA.
Yeah, really important, that incubation, I think, and that there's really a startup phase, right? Getting through that icky startup phase until it can be sort of self-sustainable. It's quite unique, actually. So not many endowed foundations, from what I see, either in New Zealand and the UK, play that sort of role. So, and I'm not 100% sure why that is, but was that a difficult one to get over the line with the trustees? Because you'd been focused a lot on helping individuals and helping people really in a really direct ways, where this is a sort of different way of helping.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't say it was difficult to get past the Wyatt board. They were definitely excited by the prospect and the opportunity. There were a lot of conversations about how it fits with Wyatt, how we establish something that may or may not end up focusing on the same things depending on what the donors at Foundation SA wanted. But I think there's definitely a commitment and an understanding that this is good for the community, that regardless of how closely donors align with what Wyatt intends to do, it's still going to be good for the community and for the people of South Australia. So that incubation period and being able to apply our knowledge our history to the development of this new entity is something that we were all really excited by.
Yeah. And just looking at South Australia again for a minute, and looking, you talked about a lot of arable land and a lot of rural issues, I guess. But what are the unique issues that face people in South Australia? Are there, and what are the main barriers to sort of a good life in terms of reaching their full potential?
So definitely looking at the inequality piece and the poverty, which of course this is why it's bread and butter, if I can call it that. We know that if you're living in a country area, a regional or remote area, your likelihood of experiencing financial hardship is extreme compared to those that are in metropolitan areas. A lot of it comes down to the cost of living. So having such remote areas in our state and the cost of getting services, of getting goods there, can be quite extreme. You can drive for 10 hours and still not be near the border of South Australia. There are definitely some very remote areas and areas that don't have vehicle access even when you're looking out on the lands and far north. So some of the issues that South Australians face, particularly outside of metropolitan areas, is really around access to services and access to the goods that we take for granted here in the city.
Mm. And you've been in the role coming up 4 years. What's been the sort of most inspirational moment in the role? Is there something that you can reflect on that has really almost changed you?
I think definitely the work that we've been doing in recent times, working with those that we seek to serve. So we've had a real concerted effort of bringing the unheard voices into our work, not only to listen, but to lead and direct our work. And some examples of that, co-design, which is a word that gets thrown around quite a bit these days, but having people who have experience of financial hardship and in some cases are still going through some of that hardship actually work with us in our office, sitting here, or likewise us sitting in their lounge rooms even, to work through what we're doing and how we're designing it, has been truly inspirational. And it's been, I would say, it's changed the way that we not only view our work, but the way that we show up at work, having that close working relationship with people that are telling us what they want us to hear and then watching us implement that has been wonderful for the people involved, but also wonderful for us as a staff group to have that privileged situation of working so closely together.
Yeah. And I think it's really important that endowed foundations, trusts and foundations that have been set up like yours as far back as 1800s, staying relevant and serving today's needs. Do you almost feel like under more pressure, you and the trustees, to, ensure it's relevant to today?
We use the term contemporary philanthropy. So what does it look like when you're 137 years old to be a contemporary philanthropist and contemporary leader? And the thing that I reflect on is really how little has changed. When you're talking about poverty and inequality, the challenges that people were experiencing 130 years ago are still the same challenges today. And so, the gold star for any kind of foundation or service organisation is to do yourself out of a job, to not be needed anymore. But sometimes my mind boggles, to be honest, that 130 to 40 years later, we are still dealing with the same issues and still trying to address the same issues. And surely it's not beyond us. We can figure this out.
Yeah. And what's been the toughest day in the office? Like, what's been the hardest challenge so far?
The interaction between philanthropy and resources trying to do good and the government policies that hold things in place, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. When you can see a clear path forward and a way that is going to impact someone experiencing financial hardship, but you've got government policies, whether it's around income support and mutual obligation and the things that people are required to do, and trying to impact that. Sometimes it can be a really tough day in the office to know that the work you're doing on the ground with individuals is also being impacted by decisions that might be happening in our federal parliament in Canberra, and what can we do to influence that.
And what was the effect of COVID for you guys? What was there, lots of lives affected, lockdowns, escalating sense of inequity, or what was COVID mean for you? Because you would have played a really important role in the response, I imagine.
Yeah, look, COVID was a really interesting case study in what can happen when people have enough, because, and we use the word unprecedented, it's been thrown around for a few years now, but it really was in our lifetime something that we hadn't seen before. And the resources that were thrown at dealing with the lockdowns and with the loss of work and income for so many people, it was actually quite amazing to watch, because all of a sudden people who were receiving income support, many of them had that doubled. So the response was to give people additional income, so an income supplement, to make sure they could get by during this period of extreme need. And all of a sudden, people that didn't have enough to get by did. So for an organisation like ours, we actually saw a little bit of demand decrease because people had enough to get by. Now, not necessarily enough to thrive long term, to create savings, to be able to get themselves to a position where that lasted. But for a period of time, we were watching this almost social experiment of people having enough to get by. And then once the pandemic started to shift and people were starting to get out of lockdown, that extra support was taken away, and that's when it bounced back. That was when WILD was really needed.
Yeah. And look, changing tack for a minute and taking you way back, and then I already want to unravel, if you like, your career journey, because it's a fascinating one. But you've ended up in a career focused on charity, philanthropy, and purpose. Growing up, is there any sort of experiences, or is there sort of reasons why you've ended up focused on a career of purpose when you look back to your upbringing and how you were brought into this world?
I don't know that there's ever a clear pathway into doing this kind of work. Certainly in my school days, my passions were law, psychology, English, and now here I am, managing money. I'm not quite sure how that ended up happening. My defining experiences as a young person, I wouldn't say that we were wealthy by any stretch. And I know, at times my parents were doing it quite tough, but I never went without. I always, there certainly wasn't anything that I ever wanted for. And my sister and I grew up in a country town. Our parents remarried when I was quite young, so I went from having quite a small nuclear family to a very large extended family. And I think all of those things define you in some way. I'm not sure how that led me to where I am, but from a very young age, I've certainly been values-driven and purpose-driven. And it sounds a bit trite, but always just wanting to give something back, wanting my little corner of the world to be a bit better because I was in it trying to do something. And that certainly defined the decisions that I've made throughout my career.
Do you remember that being a family focus? Was that something your parents kind of talked about or, touched on?
No, I mean, my parents, not so much in terms of conversations, but with 8 children between the blended families, there was a lot of running around, a lot of contribution, a lot of just having to make things happen for so many children. And so that's certainly something that has stuck with me. As I said, not wanting for anything, they worked very hard to make sure that we had, what we had. And I'm sure that had a strong influence.
Yeah, 8 competing with 7 other voices. That's to be heard. That's quite something. Do you think, did that help define your ability to communicate and get your needs met?
Oh, quite possibly. I'm sort of smack bang in the middle there. So I think we can analyse that till the cows come home. But yeah, certainly helped hone my communication and physicality at times too, I imagine.
I bet. So at university in psychology, and this sort of resonated with me, but you've ended up focusing on sort of society and making a difference across, a whole state, but started off focused on studying the sort of individual mind. And that's something I did. So I switched from psychology to sociology because that sort of macro thing made more sense when I really looked at things. But do you remember at the time psychology being really interesting, but it wasn't for you in terms of following that career path? Was there that as much thought gone into it as I've just described, or is it just...
Look, my thought probably happened a little after the fact. So I definitely enjoyed studying psychology. It was my career of choice, and I was looking forward to doing that for many, many years. And when I finished university, one of my first roles was right in the pointy end of mental health and suicide intervention work. And that's when I realised that it probably wasn't for me. So having to do that kind of work day in, day out. And at the time, I was also living in a share house where I was what was called a lead tenant. So I was doing this kind of work during the day and then coming home and living with 4 young women who were at risk of homelessness and trying to show them what it's like to be productive and get up and go to work and all of these different things. So in hindsight, it was probably, a little too much too soon, but definitely came to the conclusion that I needed to be more at the macro level, for my own personality and style of working, that doing that day-to-day individual work wasn't going to be a long-term sustainable career choice for me.
Yeah. And a realization that society shapes the mind, like it shapes our behaviors and also shapes our reality as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. And there are so many ways that you can influence and do good work at that macro level, and that's where I wanted to be.
Mm. And a confidence that actually, leadership and sort of managing assets or managing an organization was something that you aspired to back then?
Look, it happened almost by accident when I made the decision that I didn't want to do as I said, the pointy end of the work. I ended up going back to university and studying a Master of Business, majoring in philanthropy and social investment. And it was a new course. I was only in the second ever intake. And because of that, it gave me, the people that were doing the course at the time, it gave me an immediate network to those that were already working in philanthropy and doing this kind of work. So I was able to land a job relatively easily, which, I'm so very grateful for. And it was nothing more than dumb luck at the time. And starting to work, my first job in this kind of work was working in a trustee company, and it gave me amazing exposure to these charitable trusts predominantly established in people's wills. And very quickly, just through natural movement and progression within that company, I was in a managerial role quite quickly. So it was more, to be honest, good luck than good planning, but it was such an excellent sort of sounding and grounding for this kind of work.
Yeah. And, heading into some consultancy work, and it looks like you spent 5 years working for yourself effectively. What was that phase of your life like? And was that something you really flourished under, or was it challenging at times?
Yes, so I'm originally from Victoria, one of the eastern states of Australia, and like all good love stories, found myself at the pub one night and met a man from the other side of the country. So we were in Victoria and had settled and had a young family, but decided to move to South Australia to be closer to his family. And it was at that point that I thought I would have to give up my career and stop working in the philanthropic space, because the majority of the trusts and foundations are on the eastern seaboard of Australia, and we were moving to South Australia, which is more central. So I did, put my shingle out and do some consultancy and go out on my own. And that was when we moved here to Adelaide. And I really appreciated the network that created and the work that it allowed me to do. But not long after arriving here, I did end up landing a gig pretty quickly, leading a different foundation known as the Faithfuller Foundation. So the consultancy was sort of, again, a bit of a side hustle while I was also managing another foundation. But I really appreciated the ability to have a few fingers in different pies. But definitely my preference and passion is to work within organisations around that team and building that leadership to make good things happen.
Yeah. And Faithfuller Foundation, really interesting organisation. So focused on mental health and principle-based philanthropy?
Yeah, they're doing some amazing work. And we established this program at the Faithfuller Foundation, basically asking the question, when it comes to mental health, and particularly again in regional areas, what does it look like if communities are in control of their own response? So if a community is resourced to do what it is they think they need and define what it is they think they need rather than be told, what would that look like? So giving a community 10 years worth of funding so they don't need to worry about the resourcing of it. They just need to get on and do that work. And I've thoroughly enjoyed watching that go from strength to strength.
Yeah, I think absolutely vital. Philanthropy playing a role in building an ecosystem or maybe bringing about innovations, because philanthropy can fund those early stages when they don't necessarily make sense commercially or even from a fundraising perspective. But did you have a sense, and when you joined Faithfuller, did you sort of ride into town with a change approach kind of your sleeve, like we're going to do things a bit different?
Yeah, not intentionally, but that's definitely the way it worked out. The foundation was at a stage where it was growing, and where the founder was still alive but had limited involvement in directing it due to her age. So we had an opportunity where we knew we wanted to do something, but we did have an environment where we could think differently. And after years of managing family foundations and working with families where they were very much directing quite rightly directing where their funding was going. It was this blank slate opportunity of, okay, well, if I don't have to follow direction from a big family board, what is it that we would really want to do? And that gave them an environment that just allowed us to think big.
Yeah. And the shift is, you talked about it before, co-design, but effectively letting communities that you're trying to help, improve, make the best of, change their reality, like putting them at the heart of the decision making and shaping the sort of outcomes. Like that's probably a biggest change in philanthropy is around, not just top-down philanthropy from a small group of individuals who just happen to sit on the board perspective. Do you think that's the biggest change in philanthropy or certainly are on that journey at the moment?
Yeah, I'm a really big believer in just getting out of the way. So whether it's mental health or inequality or whatever it might be, more often than not, the people experiencing those issues, they're the experts. They're the ones that know what is needed and what's going to make a difference. And so you're right, that top-down philanthropy doesn't work in so many areas. So being the resource and being the connector, but knowing when to get out of the way is a shift that I'm really grateful to be seeing around the sector.
Yeah. And how important do you think lived experience, like experience of the issue, whether it's mental health, is important in terms of shaping the response? Like, are you a big believer in lived experience being part of that?
Absolutely. I think it's an integral part, and I don't want to discount the expertise that people bring, have been studying and working in the area for years, if not decades, because there's absolutely a role for that as well. But no longer can we have people with purely, whether it's ivory tower, academic work, whatever that experience is, going it alone. We absolutely need to have the voice of lived experience, living experience, lived expertise. There's all sorts of terminology around it, but we need to make sure not only is it there, but it's genuinely listened to and genuinely acted upon. So listening to this kind of input and advice and guidance and then not acting on it, I think can actually be more dangerous. So making sure that if you are engaging and having lived experience in your work, that you then have the ability to act on what you're hearing.
Yeah. And that dance we often have between the funders and those delivering the social program or the outcome or the change around, direct charitable costs and other. Is that something that you've had to sort of educate trustees and boards and people over the years around the importance of when you fund an organization to grow, to scale, to deliver impact, that you've got to, it's important to cover all of the costs?
Yeah, I think in my experience working with professional boards or working with the institutional foundations that I've had the privilege of working with, it hasn't been as much of a sell. The trustees get it. They understand that it costs money to deliver programs, and we shouldn't be putting an arbitrary percentage figure on what we will or won't pay. Where I've found that discussion a bit harder to get across the line is working with families or people that are not from the sector. So people that have, whether it's a donor advised fund within a community foundation or an individual donor, where they've worked very hard for their money and they want to see 100% of it go to whatever the cause is they're looking to support, and they don't want that administrative spend there. I find that's where the conversation sometimes happens and can be a little difficult. But I think we also have to have it. We have to be able to educate people that things cost money, that we have to pay people what it costs to deliver the work and not try and undercut it all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's where philanthropy is fascinating because it's really personal, isn't it? And people have views, right? And so where the money comes from, the source of the money, whether it's a private family or another source, then where that source is, it's really important around how it's spent or guided. But you've got to be diplomatic and you've got to take people on a journey to sort of educate them, show them, some reality of good philanthropy, bad philanthropy, negative effects that can happen.
Yeah, and I mean, I would hate to use the term bad philanthropy, and I think that's something that you often get told within this sector is there's no such thing as bad philanthropy. There's so many different ways of doing it and they're all right. And I would caveat that with saying, though, philanthropy needs to do no harm. And of course, there are situations and examples where things haven't gone quite right and individuals or communities have been harmed. But first and foremost, do no harm. And then the method of doing your philanthropy is secondary. Educating and working with families and donors is one of the better parts of these kinds of roles. It's such a privilege to be sitting around a kitchen table and having these conversations and helping people to see the different ways that they can have an impact, and even beyond their money. And it might be their time or their connections, and how that can increase the impact of the cause they're interested in. It's definitely a really privileged part of the role.
And you've taken on a number of sort of governance roles, and you're on the board of Philanthropy Australia. You touched on it before. Australia's such a massive country, significant population, but massive land mass. What's it like being on that board, and what's it like, basically your stakeholders are all of Australia?
Yeah, well, it's certainly challenging. So the Philanthropy Australia board, it's the peak body for philanthropy here in the country, and it's a representative board. So members from different kinds of foundations across different geographies are all bringing a different perspective. With all of the members, so South Australia, we have a membership base of around 70, and then the different states have different ones. So it's definitely a melting pot. And I think that's where the narrative around there is no right and wrong comes from, because you can't have hundreds and hundreds of members all doing different things and say that one is better than another. But certainly contributing to the sector in that way and being a part of the peak body is lovely. It's been a number of years now, and more recently Community Foundations Australia, which is the peak body for community foundations. So being able to be directors of those two national organisations is a real privilege.
Yeah. And both organisations, I imagine, and seen evidence of them grappling with the question around First Nation and the real importance around recognising First Nation Indigenous populations. How much is that shaping the sort of modern day philanthropy thinking and also the way you operate?
Oh, absolutely. With our referendum that's going to happen towards the end of this year, it's the topic that everyone's considering. And for a peak body, looking at it saying, well, what is our role in making a public statement? Are we speaking on behalf of members? Are we speaking as a company? What does that look like? So every board table is having that conversation. At the Wyatt Trust, we had the conversation early on. So as we said earlier, Dr. William Wyatt left his bequest. His bequest was made of land, so predominantly land holdings here in South Australia, which of course weren't his to purchase in a current day context. It was unceded land. It was land of the Kaurna people that he purchased, and then that's where our wealth came from. So as a trust ourselves, the Wyatt Trust has acknowledged and really been grappling with what truth-telling looks like for us as an organisation. We are 100% supportive of the referendum that's coming up and constitutional recognition for First Nations people. But it's more than that. That's just the tip of the iceberg. What does it mean for us as a foundation to have wealth derived from First Nations land? And how is it that we go about redressing and looking at what this means for us in the future?
Yeah, and that's fascinating actually, because around your celebrating your past as an organisation and your roots, but with all those complexities and wrongs maybe that you just described, like that can be part of your rich future, like the way you map out the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really lovely sort of story in some respects, because we recognise what's happened in the past, and yes, we want that to be our truth and we want that to be public, but we also want to take a leadership position for other organisations, particularly organisations of a similar age, and show that we do need to talk about it and we do need to be public about it, and there's nothing to fear. And we have a wonderful group of First Nations people working with us to help guide us. We have an Aboriginal researcher, Dr. Jenny Caruso, who's working with us to, from an Aboriginal perspective, write our truth and our history. And the board have committed to that being a public, whether it's a document or whatever form that takes. We don't want to sit on this, and we don't want it to sit on a shelf, and we really need to be openly and publicly talking about our truth and our history.
And you're, as we just described, you're across many boards, and you've got two roles, which is unique. But what do you do in your downtime?
Well, I have a young family, so I have two children, and I love nothing more than spending time with them and my husband. There's a lot of sport in our lives, a lot of sport at the age the kids are at. So yeah, lots of time outside, lots of reflection, just going for a walk, listening to some good music and reading a book.
Do you miss Victoria?
Absolutely. I'll always miss Victoria, but certainly South Australia is home.
Yeah. And looking to the future, in terms of your own personal career and the role that you'll be playing, what do you see for yourself?
That's the million dollar question, isn't it? I love my work. I think what makes it so easy to have so many different roles and different hats is showing up every day doing something that I really love. I'm not sure what the future holds. I do know it will be purpose driven. It will be aligned with my personal vision and values, but certainly I have no idea what's going to happen in the future, and I'm open to all possibilities.
Excellent. And I've wondered about this myself. I thought about whether if I won the lottery or came into extreme wealth, how I might set up my own personal charitable foundation. And I guess personally, a bit of admirer of Mackenzie Scott around how she's approached things in recent times. I think where I settled was quite a believer in trust-based philanthropy and relational philanthropy. So really working with human beings to do good in the world, whether that's society or the environment. But have you had the same thoughts? Is there things that you would do if you were the trustees and the CEO of your own charitable foundation?
With these conversations have happened many times over many years with my husband and I, and what would we do if we won Tats Lotto? And then we sort of laugh and say, well, the first thing we need to do is buy a ticket. So I'm not sure that it's going to happen anytime soon, but we would absolutely look to put the vast majority of our wealth into a foundation if that were the circumstances we found ourselves in. And you're right, Mackenzie Scott is incredibly inspirational, not only with what she's done, but the way she's going about it. But I also think philanthropy isn't for the uber wealthy only, and community foundations are an excellent example of how everyday mums, dads, individuals can get involved. So we became involved in a community foundation over 10 years ago, albeit with a very modest amount of money, but as a way of showing our family and our children that you can get involved and do this values-led work without needing to be uber wealthy. And over time that will grow, and with legacy plans that will be something for our children to continue. And I think a lot of people have that within their power to do. It's more about just spreading the word and letting them know that this is an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of conversation with your children, that's what you're having?
Yeah, and the boys, they completely understand. They sit around the kitchen table with us. We decide where those donations are going to go and what that's going to look like. And part of that is also letting them follow their own passions. So, my younger son was very distressed to hear about some dolphins that had passed away in a local sanctuary here, and so wanted to support the science behind understanding what was going on in the ecology of that area. Now, that was not necessarily something that my husband and I were passionate about, but allowing him to follow that, I think, has been a really important step in growing his desire to give back.
Mm. And as we was wrapping up, just focusing on where you get your inspiration from, in terms of mentors, content that you digest, what are your go-tos for, daily, weekly inspiration?
It is a real mixture. I certainly am not as much of a news hound as I used to be, and I think COVID had a bit to do with that. Reading the paper every day during COVID times did not fill my cup, and so I wouldn't say that I follow as much of the day-to-day news as I once did. But certainly I get my inspiration from those stories, from human interest stories, from real people. And there are some podcasts and books, and I always try and have a couple of books on the go just to try and hear from new people, new voices, and see what's going on out there.
Yeah. And final question for me was around an organisation, a human being that is in the sector that we should keep an eye out for, that you have a real admiration for.
Oh gosh, that would be a very long list. I think you should keep an eye on the Wyatt Trust at the, risk of trying to promote ourselves. We're in a really interesting time, a very old foundation trying to do very contemporary things. And some of that will be risky, I think, moving into the future.
And have you got other foundations who might be endowed foundations, they might have a history that's similar to yours, reaching out to you for guidance?
Yeah, well, interestingly, over the last 12 to 18 months, we have had 3 different foundations reach out to us and say, we really like what you're doing. Can we give you some money and can you just add it to what you're doing? So we've been funded from other foundations to expand our grant making. And I know we're not the only ones that have been on the receiving end of that. So that seems to be some new kind of trend that we're starting to see in philanthropy, and long may it continue. If there are good people out there doing good work, let's just support them to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Stacey Thomas, massive thank you for joining me on Purposely.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Purposely Podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review. I hope you like what you're hearing, because I sure do.